afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for this presentation. Dr. Sweta, welcome to the Center for Crisis and Risk Communication. So great that you could join us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Ben was talking about when we saw you present at the TEDx Calgary conference, and we were sitting in, it was a socially distanced event, and we were sitting in Ben's truck, and we both looked at each other and like, we have to ask her if she would be available to come to our conference. So without exaggeration, your presentation was fantastic. I'm going to raise expectations. I know you will exceed them. So thank you so much for joining us. For our audience, I'm going to read your impressive bio. Dr. Sweta Chakraborty is a risk and behavioral scientist whose work is motivated by the need for clear, credible, and evidence-based communication to urgently and proactively manage the risks that threaten human security and well-being from climate change to COVID-19. She's a correspondent for multiple publications, a book author, globally recognized keynote speaker, and is regularly interviewed on global media outlets such as CNN and the BBC. I've heard of those. She is the US representative for We Don't Have Time, the Swedish-based tech startup that launched Greta Thunberg to viral global renown. She is also the founder and principal of Adapt to Thrive, a venture that seeks to better inform individuals, businesses, and government entities on the complex, interconnected challenges such as food insecurity, civil strife already existing and emerging from a warming planet. I've never felt more inadequate than I do right now. Dr. Sweta, thank you so much for joining us here. I'm gonna turn it over to you. I know Megan's working your slides from this end, so that'll be great, and we'll follow along right here. I'm gonna ask the audience to hold the questions until after, put them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get. I know there will be lots. We'll get to as many as we can with Dr. Sweta. So thank you again, Dr. Sweta, and over to you. And super excited to hear your presentation.
Well, thank you. I'm extremely humbled by the introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you guys were able to find me. I'm also. I think it's such an important thing what you're doing. This is information that's critical for your various audiences, all the stakeholders who care about risk communication, crisis communication, for them to really know what the science behind all of this is. And that's where I come in. And I know you've had fantastic speakers already. The idea is we really need to understand our brain, and we need to confront our brains, because the takeaway is our brains haven't evolved as fast as the risk and crisis landscape around us has. And that disconnect is why we find ourselves in a lot of the situations we're in now, in terms of adapting to different risks, in terms of policy progress around these risks. So that's why these types of conferences and this type of information is so, so critical. So thank you very much for in creating this forum for engagement. Can everybody see my first slide? And then I'm happy to get started.
I can hear us squirreling in the background. We're getting that teed up right now, Dr. Sweta. So
okay, I mean, I can start. It's a picture of a planet on fire, so that's really all it is, and it really kind of sets the stage for who I am and what I do. So I wear a lot of different hats. I call myself a risk and behavioral scientist, and I apply behavioral science to addressing some of the biggest issues. And a lot of these issues really are ripple effects from the fundamental issue, which is that the planet is warming. So we are on a brand new planet that our species has never existed on since the dawn of our species. That in itself, once I learned that over a decade ago, it was one of those things that I just couldn't turn my back to. And I knew I would have to apply my expertise. In my case, it's behavioral science. In your case, it might be whatever, but everybody can contribute their background and their expertise towards addressing this problem. Because what is the point if we don't have a planet that we can actually live on and function in? We are so dependent on our environment. So once I learned that, that's where I began to apply behavioral science. And it's a good example of the application of risk communication, risk perception, behavioral science, and how all of that results in strategic communications, how strategic communications really is a key tool for addressing some of those challenges. So I do wear a lot of different hats, but I'm going to talk about this in the context of COVID-19. It's a shared global risk that we are all living under and living with right now. There's not a single one of us that hasn't been impacted by COVID in some way. So I'm a member on EcoHealth Alliance's Leadership Council, and it's a group based in New York City, and it does global disease surveillance and mitigation. And we've identified almost 1.5 million viruses that could make a zoonotic animal to human jump and begin human to human transmission. So COVID is one out of potentially, million plus more that could emerge. And the fact that we haven't had more COVID type outbreaks is really what the story should be, given the really bad human behaviors, the risky behaviors we're engaging with that increase the probability of these types of, oh, sorry. Can everybody still see me?
Yeah, we're just pulling up your slides now, Dr. Sweta. Yep.
Okay.
So we can see you at the top of the screen, and now we can run. We've got your slides ready to roll.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, that changed my screen a little
bit.
So
Yeah, sorry about that. You're welcome for the advance warning. Yeah.
No, thank you. So COVID is actually a mild disease by virology standards. So there's potential for far more lethal viruses to emerge, right? And we've seen from COVID-19 just how disruptive even a mild virus can be. So the takeaway is that we need to stop these viruses from ever emerging in the first place. So we need to be really proactively prepared, because when there isn't an outbreak, what we see is complacency. And when there is an outbreak, there's panic. So why is that, right? This is behavioral science 101. If we could go to slide 2. Okay, so I look at this as a behavioral scientist to understand the gap between what is risk reality and what is risk perception. And these are rarely aligned, regardless of what we're talking about. People are not well calibrated when it comes to assessing risk, especially when it's cumulative risk. So an example of this is like smoking one cigarette versus one cigarette a day over time. If you think of it as just one cigarette, despite it being every day, then you're skewing your assessment of future absolute risk. In this case, let's say it's lung cancer. And I've talked about this a lot related to COVID. So for example, I get asked a lot if we're going to see a improvement in our global energy emissions because of COVID, because it's shut down global transportation. And we will. We're going to see an 8% decrease by the end of 2020 in terms of global energy reductions. But that's just a blip on the planet warming trajectory that we're on. It's like not smoking one cigarette one day on the path to lung cancer, right? It's not consequential. And so this makes sense once it's explained like this and people get it, but it's not intuitive for us to understand cumulative risk. Our brains aren't wired to understand cumulative risk. Our ancestors didn't have to think about it. It was day-to-day survival for them. And our brains just haven't caught up to this complex risk landscape that we've created, that we now reside in. So our ancestors would see a snake and run away, right? And that's worked out great for human evolution. Think about it. We probably aren't related to the ancestors who didn't run away from that snake. So while our brain's cognitive wiring has worked out through the majority of our time as species on this earth, it's less helpful to us now in the complex risk landscape that we find ourselves in. So this is what we have to remember. We aren't designed to understand or conduct complex risk analysis, but we have to overcome these cognitive limitations. This is because we exist now in a world that has increasingly strained resources, and so not conducting cost-benefit analysis to understand real risk and rather making decisions based on perceptions, not only is it unhelpful, it's truly costly, not just in terms of economic cost, but in terms of public health, in terms of the lives we've seen lost because of COVID-19, especially here in the States where I'm based. So here, let me try to convince you that this is what's actually going on. I'm going to, please go to the next slide. And you should see a cinema ticket. I can't tell if we're on that slide. Yes, slide 3, thank you. Okay, so just think to yourselves, if you were going to the movies and you had $20 in your wallet, or however much a movie cost, especially before this lockdown, let's say roughly a $20 movie ticket to see a movie, and you make your way to the theater and you realize that you've lost the $20 in your wallet. Do you buy a ticket anyway to go see the movie? Just think about that for a second. What would you do, right? Now here's another scenario. You've got the ticket in your wallet. You're on your way to the movies. You get to the movie theater and you go to take out the ticket. You realize you've lost the ticket itself. Do you buy another ticket to go see that movie? The ticket's valued at $20, same thing. How many of you answered consistently between those two scenarios? and who didn't answer consistently. I obviously can't see the audience, but this is really for you to think critically and ask yourselves, if you answered consistently, that's a rational response. Whether the ticket is whether it's the value of $20 is as a ticket or as the dollar bill, it shouldn't make a difference in terms of your decision making. You should still have the same response regardless. That's what we would consider rational behavioral decision making. Versus those of you, and this is what we consistently see when we use this example. And again, it's fine. That's how humans are wired. Because we frame one as a $20 bill versus as a ticket, our decision making changes. So most people will say they would still spend $20 if they lost $20, but they would not buy another ticket if they lost the ticket. So think about that for a second. That is a innate bias that we call honoring sunk costs. And I'll get into a few more examples and a few more examples of how our brains actually play tricks on us and make us make irrational decisions. And this is an example. This is one example of how we make inconsistent choices. And so much of our society is designed on us being rational decision makers. But a simple exercise like this, you can see how that's not the case. We systematically depart from rational decision making, and we're influenced by something like this, framing effects, and many, many other effects, cognitive triggers, I like to call them. You might be arguing with me in your head, and you might be saying, no, wait, that's not true. I'm rational. I get that a lot, right? What you're experiencing is cognitive dissonance. It's that uncomfortable feeling you get when you have to process information that might not be pleasant. In this case, the reality of the fact that we are all really irrational decision makers. You're not rational, you're probably saying to yourself, and you're not, but that's okay. That's the point. Try this exercise with friends and family and see what happens, and allow me to convince you that this is actually what's going on. We can move to the next slide. So let me just give a little science background without getting too technical on what is cognitive behavioral science. It's a part of behavioral science. It's the cross-disciplinary science of understanding what causes individual, group, and organizational behavior across different levels. So behavioral science encompasses social science, and it brings together insights and methods from a variety of fields and discipline, like decision-making, like behavioral economics, organizational behavior, neuroscience. So under this umbrella, behavioral science is trying to use all of these disciplines to actually give a complete picture of human behavior, which these disciplines separately cannot do. So it offers a comprehensive toolkit to really bridge that gap between economic rationality and everyday reality. And it really helps to account for much of the phenomenon in human thinking and learning. And I just want to make the point, this is not to be confused with cognitive behavioral therapy. That's a common type of therapy where you work with a mental health counselor or a therapist in a structured way. I am not a therapist. This is not a therapy session. So that's the difference. That's cognitive behavioral science. And then we want to talk about what is rational versus bounded rationality. So I've made the case we systematically depart from rational thinking and decision making. So what we do is we use things, we use different mechanisms we have that has worked again for our ancestors, that immediate response to flight when encountering a risk in front of you, like a snake or a tiger. And that's good enough for us. That's been good enough for us to adapt to our environment. And it's a rational response, but we're bounded in that rationality. So it's when an organism like humans with rather modest computational capabilities, we're not supercomputers, right? Our brains look much closer to what our ancestors look like than they do to AI supercomputers of the future that are actually here now too. We have modest computational capabilities to really assess our risk and make decisions. So we have to be bounded in our rationality to be able to adapt and engage in a complex world that's full of risky decisions. So the way we do this is through heuristics. And that's when there are problems that don't have an immediate solution and require analysis. And humans, again, because we're cognitively limited, we look for and we reach for shortcuts that can help us get around that computational requirements to really make rational decisions. This is what we refer to as heuristic or selective search. And it's our cognitive laziness that encourages us to do this. And sometimes, again, it's been great. It's helped us evolve. And it's that quick decision-making response system that makes us immediately come up with a solution, like you did with the movie ticket. But it doesn't always work out. It doesn't always help when we're trying to be accurate, right? So a few more examples of this. Let's go to, so the first one, honoring sunk costs is one example. That was the movie ticket example. Then we have, and that's also that's framing as well. So availability is an example of what, and I'm sure this has come up through this conference, or you've definitely, if you're interested in this topic, you must have heard this, but the idea that we misjudge risk so badly. So if you think about two risks, one more sensational than the other, why is it that one risk just comes to mind easier? And because of that, we attribute more frequency and probability around that particular risk than is actually the true base rate statistic of that risk. So the example I like to give is, what's more likely to kill you, falling airplane parts or shark attacks? And if you think about it, or try this with your friends and family, the immediate response is usually to say shark attacks. It's that much more salient. It's that much more sexy. Unfortunately, that's a word that's used to describe terrorist attacks in this capacity as well, because it's something that is going to capture headlines and captures people's attention. It is propagated through the media that much more, despite the actual reality of the base rate statistic behind the amount of fatalities on an annual basis caused by either shark attacks or terrorist attacks, compared to things like people dying from radon gas or people dying from falling airplane parts. Falling airplane parts are 30 times more likely to kill you than shark attacks in any given year. So if you just think about that, it's another example of how our brain immediately jumps to conclusions in order to find a solution to a problem that it's confronted with. Another example, another heuristic I would point out is anchoring and adjustment. Sorry, I don't believe I have it listed on here, but I'll give you an example of, I do this with audiences all the time. Students especially are not a great audience for this because they tend to be a little too smart in terms of their knowledge of some of these examples, in the sense that, so I was in a classroom in Washington, DC, and I divided the students into two groups, and I showed one group, I primed one group with the Lincoln Memorial, which is about 100 meters tall. And I primed another group with the Taipei Tower, which is about 1,000 meters tall. And then I asked them what they believe the height of the Washington Monument to be. And it usually works. With the right audience, it works well. The one you prime with the higher number is always going to use that number as an anchor and then adjust accordingly. So with the Taipei Tower, usually people kind of just adjust down. So they'll say the Washington Monument is maybe within 100 meters of that. Or with the Lincoln Memorial, they'll adjust up and they'll say it's a little bit taller, and nobody ever gets it right. But then this class in Washington, DC, and this was my foolishness, got it right on the head because they had just done a field trip there. So they answered right. It's 555 meters tall. So it doesn't, you have to know your audience if you're going to test an anchoring and adjustment heuristic. But that's another example of usually how we are influenced by seemingly unrelated factors, right? And this has been robust and found. It's decades of research that has proven this now over and over. And ultimately, the reason we do this is because the cognitive laziness that we have, we just want to satisfy. It's good enough, basically, is what we're looking for as human beings, to be able to live and navigate through this complex risk landscape. And so if we can find a solution that we reasonably can achieve through these different decision-making tactics that are ingrained in us, it allows us to halt our search for a solution as long as the solution we found more or less meets our expectations. So that's really what's going on here. And that is what we need to understand about our brains. And if I've made the case about how our brains are wired, then this shouldn't be surprising to you. So if we could please go to the next slide. This is a graphic I actually designed myself. So feel free to use it if you like. Just please give credit to my company, Adapt to Thrive. I am comparing different perceptions versus actual risk. So looking at the perception of a plane crash versus the reality of a plane crash in any given year. In the same vein, so we overestimate, again, these sexy salient risks, plane crashes, GMOs, swine flu. These are all things we've overestimated versus the real hazard. And then on the other end of the spectrum, same thing. We underestimate heart disease. We underestimate Alzheimer's, radon gas, heat, versus like the actual reality of what we're facing with them. And so this is this consistent departure back and forth that is just rarely aligned or well calibrated to the reality of the risk. And we get it wrong across everything. I mean, it's very rare. The fun fact I like to share during this slide is, who's actually the most calibrated of all professions are meteorologists, because they really know when they're confident about how right they are and how wrong they are, because that's what they do for a living. And there's immediate feedback. If your weatherman or woman tells you that it's going to rain and it doesn't, or it's not going to rain and it does rain, the feedback forces them to just get much, much better about their predictive capabilities. But the rest of us, we don't have that immediate feedback. So we tend to just be really poor at predicting the reality of the risks we face. And next slide, please. None of us are immune to this, not even those of us who study it. So we systematically overestimate and underestimate our ability to control just generally our landscape. And we overestimate our abilities, we underestimate our vulnerabilities. And we really care about things that aren't that serious, like getting vaccinated, like eating non-organic foods. And we underestimate serious risks, like our vulnerability to hurricanes, to flooding. We think that it's not going to happen to us. We're programmed to be overconfident, and we're programmed to ignore serious but slow-moving, seemingly faraway risks, like sea level rise is a good example. Try to get that on somebody's radar, or coastal erosion. These things just are not sexy enough for people to process them at the forefront. They'd much rather hear about a shooter event. And if this was just restricted to, our quirky brain challenges, then great, but there's some real world implications here, because ultimately this is going to determine where we allocate our time, attention, our resources, what our priorities are, what our policymakers are going to spend their time on. It's a reflection of what we care about, and what we care about comes from our perceptions. So we really need to confront our brains, and we really need to get better aligned to the reality of the risk. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, yes, all of these different triggers that actually result in our perception. What increases our perception of risk versus what doesn't. I'll use COVID as an example. COVID really triggered all of our cognitive hot buttons. If you look at the factors listed on here, we have naturalness. How natural is something? How much can we control it? How much knowledge do we have about it? How familiar is it? Are we volunteering? Are we being exposed out of our control? Is it voluntary or not? How severe will the consequences be? Are they equitably distributed? Who's affected? So all of these factors, COVID hit. And there's a few, this isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but these are just examples. COVID also is invisible. And so all of these things increase our perception of risk. And you can pick a risk, and you can put it against these various factors and see where I'm going with this. Does it increase our perception or decrease our perception based on whether or not we're familiar, whether or not we're worried about it being fair? Is it unequally affecting younger people and older people? That increases our perception of risk if it is. COVID's another example of that. It was disproportionately impacting the elderly. So these are all factors that really feed into our perception. And there's another big one. Next slide, please. Another big one that I've studied extensively as a primary researcher when I was actively researching in academia. I've since now moved to policy and media primarily because I want to share this with the public. There's so much great information here. It's not disseminated. It's not communicated to the people that could use it the most. But that doesn't mean that there isn't incredible research coming out of academia in this field. One being the role of trust. And what I learned is that trust is really broken, especially in American society and in science. Here in America, we're more polarized than ever as a nation, to the point where even medical and public health science isn't even immune. For a long time, scientists would showcase infectious disease as one of the rare few risks you couldn't use to identify a person's political affiliation, unlike climate change, for example, or genetically modified foods. But now we can, right? We know in America, conservatives attribute less perceived risk to the threat of COVID-19. And as a cognitive scientist, we term this phenomenon again to be cognitive dissonance. If you are confronted, if you have these various factors that are playing into your perception of risk, and you're presented with science or data that directly conflicts with any sort of entrenched belief that you have or perception that you have, you are going to put your walls up. You're going to put barriers up. Some of you might have come across this in engaging in discussions related to climate change, related to COVID, whatever it is where you find conflict or you find pushback. Remember that this is a natural defense mechanism that people have. And what we're learning increasingly out of the field of sociology is the extent to which this is becoming more and more ingrained in somebody's tribal identity. So your perceptions are now, your stance on an issue like climate change is inextricably linked to your political affiliation. And that is why we can predict what your political affiliation is based on where you stand on the topic of, let's say, climate change, on police brutality, on Black Lives Matter. And the fact that these are so intercorrelated at this point just goes to show how much more difficult it's going to be to actually communicate facts and science, because it doesn't matter. Once something is that integrated into your identity, it becomes that much more challenging, and there's that much more dissonance to overcome. We can overcome it though, and that's my point. We just have to recognize that rather than get annoyed or frustrated with people when they don't necessarily listen to what we perceive to be the facts, right? The facts are relative when it comes to perceptions. So what does this mean for us going forward? We're on the right side, yes. So we must apply the gold standard in risk perception and communication to science to appropriately contain COVID. And that doesn't mean, I'm talking about COVID in this case, but again, we can use a variety of different risks to discuss, to make the same point. We can never promise zero risk. That's what to be alive means, to have to face some level of risk. We can demand less risk, but we can never be guaranteed zero risk. And that's another thing that's really critical that needs to be better communicated to various stakeholders. There's no such thing as zero risk. Nobody can guarantee that. And historically, the public's always demanded from policymakers zero risk, right? Regardless of the food that we're eating. Think about the reactions when there's a food recall. We have one of the safest food systems we've ever had. Food is more regulated than any other industry, and we're safer than we've ever been. We're living longer than we've ever been. And yet there is increasing demand for more safety around the food we eat, for better health outcomes as well, despite the fact that things are actually, if compared to any other time in our history, better. So zero risk is unrealistic, and we have to live with cost-benefit trade-offs. And people will increasingly, we'll see with COVID, and we're already seeing it, that people will trade off the risk of COVID to attend their favorite restaurants and bars. But the trade-offs aren't universal, and that's a key takeaway. There's different levels of tolerance across different societies. Like we know in Sweden, the tolerance for COVID-19 is higher than right now. For example, in America, the trade-off was really fascinating when we had those who were, I don't know how much the Canadian audience followed this, but you had a lot of shaming going on of those who were mass gathering during the initial lockdown. And then the police brutality cases emerged, and almost overnight, there was the shaming from mass gatherings gave way to increased support of mass gatherings in the form of protests against police brutality. This is an example. None of this is right or wrong. It's not that. It's just an example of how risk is traded off on a regular basis. Things just they'll re-rank themselves, and new risks will be prioritized. Again, it's not necessarily entrenched in any sort of reality or base rate statistic. It's all based on our perceptions and what's important to us in that particular moment. So risk tolerance and risks are fluid. They're transient in nature. They vary over time and across groups. And this is why it's so critical, because there's so many factors, contextual factors that aren't aligned to the reality. The only way we can actually successfully move forward is if we align as much as we can to the numbers, because there's just too many other factors, from political identity to how familiar something is, how salient something is, that can influence how we feel about a particular risk. And it varies so much globally that if we don't use science and numbers and evidence as our sorting principle and our prioritization principle, then there's really no rhyme or reason to doing it, to really coming up with a systematic plan forward. And ultimately that will be what is best for society when we actually entrench it in the reality of the numbers we're dealing with. So right now we're in the middle of Corona, and it seems impossible that we'll forget just how bad it is, right? But we're cognitively wired to return to complacency. Think about it. We can only comprehend risk for so long. We can only stay alert to risk for so long. And the perceived threat, once it dissipates, we return to default status. So think about, do you remember how scared you were during Ebola, during MERS, during SARS? Do you recall when you stopped being scared, right? It's these things are very, very transient. It's so bad that, and we become so complacent to disease, actually, we've become complacent to diseases that we've actually found solutions for already. We actually have the audacity to stop vaccinating our children and seeing some of these diseases even reemerge, like MMR. And we need to break this cycle. So the key is to take advantage of the cognitive window we have while a crisis is happening. So right now during COVID is the time to actually use tools and strategies of communication, among other things, and to put a stop to bad behaviors like wet markets, like establish widespread cultural norms that can prove really, really disruptive. And it's also a really good time to put in place new behaviors and to really normalize them, like enhanced hygiene measures. And that should persist long after COVID is forgotten. That's the goal. That's where we come in as behavioral scientists and risk communicators. So the time to do that is now, while we have the public's attention, when people are looking to regain some sense of control, when they still want to protect their elderly, protect their children, and reduce involuntary exposure, and offset all of the factors that we discussed initially that create this high perceived risk of COVID. Now's the time for us. And effective communication is how to do this. So effective communication is achieved by first mapping risk perceptions in various and across various demographics, communities, and however, people can really be grouped in a way that communications can be effectively tailored, right? It's not one message fits all. We've learned that the hard way. It's why we find ourselves in a lot of the situations we're in. They have to be delivered then through a trusted communicator. Remember the slide on trust, that is critical. And it has to be tailored for that specific group through that specific person that could reach that group. So you would not have the same message by the same person for a middle-aged white woman in Missouri that you would have for an immigrant Gen Zer in New York City. But risk information needs to reach them, and it needs to be interpreted as it's intended for beneficial behavioral outcomes for both individuals and for wider society. So this is what needs to be considered as we learn from COVID and we move into the next phases of reopening or lockdowns, right? There are communications that we need to take into account as the situation develops. So this is key for developing effective communication strategies, and it's to establish really evidence-based interventions that will survive our complacency, that will survive even after COVID is long forgotten. And remember, we're still on this planet warming trajectory, which means that there's going to be intense, frequent, simultaneous impacts of climate change, including these increasing emerging and persistent infectious diseases. So we can't not afford to learn from this and to start from a better place next time, because unfortunately, we're going to need to be applying it soon. Could you actually go back? Sorry, I was still on the standard.
Yeah, sorry, Dr. Sweta, yep.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Okay, so I'd love for these to be the key takeaways. I have these as bullet points. I don't like using a lot of words on my slides, but I think this is important for the audience to see in writing, and we'll just go through this. So how do you do everything that we talked about? How do we hit that gold standard of risk communication? First, it's really, really important to understand this. What is it that the target audience that you're communicating to, what do they understand? Oh, you know what? This is a really specific slide on genetic modification. Apologies for that. I was giving a talk on that particular risk, but again, you can switch out the risk with any real risk. So let's say we're talking about COVID. What does the target audience understand about risks associated with COVID-19? What does the target audience want to know about the risk? Does your audience that you're communicating it think the risk is high or low or non-existent even? What is the audience's specific concerns and perceptions? Who does it perceive to be most vulnerable to this risk we're talking about? How does the target audience prefer to receive information about, let's say, COVID-19? Is it through scientists? Is it through spokesperson from your company? Is it through the policymaker or the local mayor or who? Again, it depends on what you do and who your end audience is, but we really need to determine who the right person to communicate to your audience should be. What are the sources of information that the target audience trusts? Is it the media? Is it scientists? Is it local policymakers? All of this needs to be thought about and decided before any real successful communication should be disseminated. And are the information sources and channels which are planned to be used, are they accessible to the target audience? So like there's no point in communicating to a demographic that doesn't have access to the internet, but your primary form of communication is your website. You would be surprised how these are actually still very serious issues that we deal with on a regular basis in our line of work. Next slide, please. And so as you think these through, what are the things you have to remember? And again, we can get into much, much more detail, which is a much longer session than this one, in terms of how to actually craft communications. And there's a real science behind it, which we, again, don't have the time to get into, but there's some key takeaways I would love for you to keep in mind at a bare minimum as you think about communicating risk. People want to know the truth, even if it's worrisome. Don't sugarcoat anything. People can only absorb a limited amount of new information at a time. Remember when we talked about cumulative risk and the inability for people to judge risk? That is something that has other implications too. People don't absorb that much information in a way that is going to be efficient and effective for them. So people don't understand cumulative risk. They fall prey to these innate biases. All of this must be kept in mind as you think about communication strategies. Emotions can cloud decision-making, but in very predictable ways. If you know your audience is charged up and angry about something, if you know that they're sad about something, if they're happy, what does that mean in terms of how your communication is going to be received? Even the most experienced communicators cannot accurately predict how their messages will be interpreted, especially with novel topics and especially with unfamiliar audiences. So testing and evaluation are critical. Don't skip this step. This is the difference between all your hard work and effort resulting in a successful interpretation and ultimately a behavioral outcome in your audience. If what you're trying to do is have people process information and actually respond to it in a way that is positive for themselves, their families, their communities, this is not a step to be skipped. We have to test and make sure we are getting the ultimate outcome that we're aiming for. You'd be surprised how people don't expect the outcomes that ultimately come through. Even researchers, again, myself, I haven't been a primary researcher for most of my career, but those who have tell me they're regularly surprised at outcomes, even though they've been doing it their entire professional careers. That shouldn't surprise us. People always have the ability to surprise. It shouldn't surprise us that people have the ability to surprise us. People also exaggerate their ability to predict other people's behavior. Again, this is like true of any professional in this space. Who do we think we are? Even if we've been studying this and working in this for a really long time, people will always surprise us. And people generally do make sensible decisions. There is a positive here, and this is what I want to end on. People will do what you hope they will do because we have more in common than we don't. We are fundamentally still humans. We do have a blueprint that we're born with, which includes that we care about children, we care about the elderly. We have more in common than not, and we have to remember that. We also do want to make sensible decisions, but for us to do that well, we really require accurate, timely, and credible information. So that's critical to remember. I want to leave on that. And the final slide is just the best way to contact me if I can add more information, be of further service. So thank you very much for your time and your attention, and I will leave it there. Thank you.
Dr. Sweta, thank you so much for that. That was awesome. I'll leave your contact information up for a bit here. Let me, I'd just like to I love the shark attack, aircraft parts falling and killing you. That'll resonate particularly well with one of our board members here at the CCRC, Chasten Remillard, who has a fascination with sharks. I'm sure he would go with that shark attack would be more likely. I'd like to unpack a little bit if I could.
Sure.
And I love what you said, and I'm gonna tee you up here, and I know you've got the comeback ready for this, but I love that what you said about that people from on the political spectrum from the right attack you and people from the left attack you, and that you've had comments that say, why don't you go back to your own country? And of course you're from
America.
Yeah, I think New Jersey, right?
New Jersey, yes.
Right. So I love that. I love that retort. So
yeah.
When did this happen? I saw an article recently about an FCC decision in the late 80s that took out the need for news informations to have balance in their stories, and then that's really led to essentially people making money off of exaggerating political views. Do you have an idea of when you look back, is there a turning point that you think happened in society, with the advent of technology, or when you look back with all your experience and expertise and research in the area, where do you think it happened? Where did we get so polarized?
It's so fun you're asking me that because I'm currently participating, and this will sound like a bit of a plug, I was not planning it. I'm currently participating in a virtual book club called 99 Pages. And it's a LinkedIn initiative, and you can see it across all platforms. It's totally free to tune in. It's every Sunday evening at 7:30 Eastern time for me. So I guess that's 5 p.m. for your audience in Canada. And I'm part of a panel of experts, including 3 others, and we are putting forward our thoughts on the book Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein. Again, no relationship to him, and absolutely getting nothing out of this in that sense. It's a really great study on exactly this question. So he's a journalist, he's the founder of Vox, and he's currently the editor at large. And he came out with this book, I think it was the beginning of this year, really trying to understand why everybody was so shocked when Trump won, including Hillary Clinton. She wrote a piece saying, how did that happen, right? I think the name of her book was What Happened? And then there's been a lot of investigation into and from the social sciences, really, to understand, was this really that shocking? When did it get to this point, and how did it happen? So it's a really good book that delves into this. And we've only read the first 100 pages, but it does answer your question. So it gives a lot of history into how we became more polarized here in the US. And it wasn't this bad, right? You could actually, right now, and here is a fact that just blew my mind, is that independents or moderate, those who claim to be independent or moderate, are more, it's more predictable how they're going to vote, left or right, in the US, versus those who had identified on one side or the other 50 years ago. So even as we're becoming identifying as less polarized, we are still, our voting behavior is becoming increasingly predictable. And the reason for that is our identities are everything. Based on your religion, your geographic location, your belief on climate change, your stance on police brutality, you can predict how somebody's going to vote, right? I mean, you can predict what their political identity is, and then based on that, you can predict how they're going to vote. And that really has increased every single decade as identity became more and more entrenched across a variety of issues. And in the past, even with climate change, even with some of these issues that seem like impossible to find common ground now, that wasn't the case. Even like 15, 20 years ago, I forgot the exact bill, the name here in the US, but they were able to move forward with a environmental protection here, and they crossed parties and they were able to do it. A bill like that has so much opposition now. The idea of passing a climate bill in this environment is just, it seems absolutely insurmountable. And the reason is because we are just too scared to move beyond what our tribal identity and the spokesperson for that identity says is sticking to the identity. So you cannot deviate on one issue and still be considered part of that in-group. And being part of that in-group is the most, it is so intrinsic to us. It's another thing we're born with as part of this blueprint. A famous sociologist named Jonathan Haidt, he wrote The Righteous Mind. He's a professor at NYU, somebody I know well, and who's just absolutely fantastic. I think he has a TED Talk as well. Actually 2. He's talked about, he's one of the co-authors and has done a lot of research directly himself on understanding what is it that humans, what do we have in common from a sociology, anthropology point of view. So it's that blueprint we're born with. Reciprocity is an example. If we do something for someone, we expect them to do something in return. Caring for our children is one, caring for our elderly. And the main one is the need to belong to an in-group. And it's because of that survival. Because if we weren't part of an in-group, we were going to be the one left behind and attacked by that tiger. And as our groups have increased, as population has increased, increasingly, we are digging in our heels to still have that tribal identity because of it's how we're wired. And so that really does begin to explain why we are increasingly more stubborn than ever on a host of issues that really shouldn't have anything to do with what our identity is. So that, I mean, it's I recommend you, the book is great. Jonathan Haidt's work is really great too, if you want to delve deeper into this, and check out kind of our take on it on the 99 Pages Club as well. I'd love to get your feedback on that.
I will do for sure. And I want to get to, there's another question here, but I love what you said, and I'm going to paraphrase from John F. Kennedy's inaugural speech that he said, we all inhabit the same planet. We all cherish our children's future. One of the questions is here, do you ever see us getting back to a more balanced reporting with the media and or that middle ground that you talked about, even though we are so entrenched in our tribes?
So politics and media is a reflection of what's going on with the public and what the public wants and demands. And Ezra Klein, as a reporter, talks about this too. There's a whole chapter on media polarization as well. Why some of these news channels are so extreme. It's like you're watching two different planets. Like you're on a completely different planet if you're watching Fox versus if you're watching CNN in terms of what's happening in the landscape in the U.S., especially leading up to the election. But the idea is it's a reflection of what the audience wants. And there were really wonky but really important press conferences that would happen during the Obama administration that he cites, that press releases would go out to the mainstream media and say, we want you to cover this. We're talking about healthcare. We're talking about like the reasoning behind the healthcare bill or whatever topic it was. And nobody covered it. And nobody covered it because it wasn't exciting enough to cover, because they knew the public would not respond. And this is risk perception. This is because we want to see headlines that are scandalous, that are just, sensational. That's what we as human beings are wired to do. And the media is a reflection of that. So and that's why everything I do and the way I begin these talks and end these talks is, we are responsible at an individual level for regaining control of our brains. We need to overcome that because we're destroying our planet. We're destroying our societies because we're allowing our ancestral wiring to dictate how we are engaging with each other in an environment that is so vastly different from what our brains are comfortable with. We're talking about 9.8 billion people, 10 billion people on the planet, basically by 2050. That's more than, we're used to comfortably with groups of 50 to 100. So now we have to think about numbers that are unfathomable, that we've never actually processed. So if we don't do the work at the individual level to confront our innate biases and overcome them, what can we really demand or expect from those who are responding to our desires, wants, and needs? So we need to confront our brains, and there's ways to do that. That was part of my TED Talk, you might remember. But I'm happy to talk about that in more detail, exactly how we overcome our own shortcomings, cognitive shortcomings.
Well, why don't we? I've got a couple minutes. I love talking to you. It's so. Why don't we unpack that a little bit? How do we give me the short list of how we would what immediate steps we can take to overcome our hard wiring in 2020?
Yeah. So pick a topic and really ask yourself, and don't wait for somebody to ask you, but why do you have a certain perception of something? Why is it that any issue that comes to the forefront in America, there's so many to choose from that are just in the news all the time, right? Whether it is Black Lives Matter, whether it is police brutality, whether it is climate change, healthcare, any of the topics that have come up in the debates as well. Why are you responding to it? And this is question number one. And what is influencing, what subliminal factors are you not perceiving that are influencing your perception of your position or opinion on that particular topic? Be critical of your own perception. Why did you just react positively or negatively? Where do you fall on the spectrum in response to a certain policy? Are you for it? Are you against it? Are you like supporting Black Lives Matter? Are you not? Do you perceive police brutality to be a bigger risk than it is, or do you not? Or do you underestimate the risk? And then actually look at the base rate statistics of it. I mean, these are numbers that are available. So you can actually do simple searches and say, wait, the reality of how many people die every year from the flu is in America is like something on average about 40,000 Americans. And yet I don't take my flu shot. But when COVID-19 was getting to those numbers, obviously we're well past it now. It was, why was I so much more worried? Even if the numbers, let's say COVID hypothetically landed in the same bucket as the flu, ultimately, why were we so much more worried, and why did we perceive such higher risk to COVID than we did the flu? That's interesting. And it's because of those cognitive triggers. It's because of familiarity. It's because it was new. It was because it affected the elderly. All of those triggers that actually, again, are contextual and shouldn't influence our perceptions, they do. So you need to confront what are the different cognitive triggers that are influencing your perceptions, then become really radically committed to aligning yourself to the actual base rate statistic. What is the actual number? Based on that, try and close that gap. That's what we need to do as individuals. If we can become more science, data, evidence-based, then it won't matter where our identities are. Ultimately, we will demand for people to for policy, for media, for everything to become more aligned to the data and to the science. And that is going to be so important as the planet warms, as we're faced with additional increasing impacts of climate change, and as we increase the number of people on the planet. There's no other way we can approach how to find solutions to all of this than from the science, starting from science. It can't be from a left point of view or a right point of view. It has to be from evidence-based. And so we have to start by confronting our brains, dealing with those innate biases, understanding what is actually impacting us, and forcing ourselves to question every single time we have a perception and a decision coming out of that perception, what actually influenced us. That's step one. I'm actually coming out with a book on this in more detail. So please,
well,
please keep an eye out for that.
I can't wait to read it. Dr. Sweta, I could talk to you all day long. Thank you so much for taking the time and your fantastic presentation. I hope when the border opens up again that you'll be able to make it up to Canada. I know we're going to do our best to get down to the U.S. and I'm gonna finish with a quote from John F. Kennedy again. When he talked about Canada and the U.S., he said, "Geography has made us neighbors. History has made us friends." So, thank you again so much. Really appreciate you taking the time. And we've got your presentation here. If anybody in the audience would like to reach out, we can share Dr. Sweta's contact information with you, and that's fantastic. Thanks so much again.
Thank you,
Dr.
Jeff.
Sweta Chakraborty. Thanks everybody. We're gonna take a quick break. I think by my clock, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes until the top of the hour. We're gonna come back with Dr. Steve Jordans from the University of Toronto. So thanks again, Dr. Sweta.